Thank you very much, Joe. Excuse me while I get used to my audio leash here. May take a little bit of time. Thank you very much, Joe, for that introduction, and welcome again to this talk. I want to say a word first about the title of the talk, The Mindfulness Revolution. I don't mean to suggest that mindfulness itself is a revolution. It goes back 2,500 years in the East, and ideas like it appeared in the West not more than a few hundred years later. So it's very old. What I meant to suggest by the title is that the recent enthusiasm and enthusiastic adoption of mindfulness techniques, training, and experience in the West is the result of one or two revolutions in our own thinking here in the West. And in particular, our own thinking about the relationship between the mind and the body. Now, as you may know, for 500 or 600 or 700 years, the West has Western science, Western philosophy, Western medicine has labored under the misapprehension that the mind and the body are two very separate entities. They interact, sure, but mostly the focus was on the effects of body state on the mind. Watch enough television and you will see advertisements for every kind of physical approach to mental events that you can imagine. Drugs for anxiety, drugs for depression, drugs for anything you can possibly name. Affect the body and you affect the mind. And I think we all know that, right? What was less well appreciated until recently, I think, was the enormous impact that the state of the mind has on the state of the body. Right? That came out of the Eastern traditions, by and large. And I think we're beginning now to really appreciate to an appropriate extent the extent to which that's true. I think for most of us, well, not most of us, but most of us of a certain age, our first introduction to the philosophy and psychology of the East, the Eastern traditions, came in the 1960s, a time which some of us still remember fondly if we were not under the influence of too many drugs. In the 60s, as some of you may know, the Beatles famously went off to India, where they studied under a number of gurus and brought back the sitar and a few other things. At about the same time, the LSD gurus at Harvard, Timothy Leary, seen here, and Richard Alpert, later named Ram Dass, began touting the effects of LSD on mental states and tying them into a more Eastern Buddhist approach to the view of life. There followed very shortly the Eastern individuals like the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi here, and various forms of Eastern meditative tradition. The yogi there brought transcendental meditation along, and mindfulness soon followed a few years later. Now, the thing about mind, well, I should mention Alpert again. Richard Alpert had said Ram Dass. If you want to understand briefly what mindfulness is about, you can do no better than the three-word title of his 1972 book, Be Here Now. It was also the title of, I think, an Oasis album or something. Anyway, but it is the best three-word summary of what mindfulness is about. It doesn't capture all of it, of course, that I can think of. So keep your mind tuned to this one. We'll come back to this a bit later. Now, in the years since mindfulness was introduced, it has made its way very heavily into Western medicine and psychology and science. Books and articles on mindfulness total right now about 2,500 in the last 25 years. And they've appeared in some of the most prestigious and well-respected scientific journals in the entire scientific canon, including these. A couple in particular I find interesting. Brain Behavior and Immunity. Psychoneuroimmunology. Psychoneuroendocrinology will be here somewhere. I mean, this is a very big thing that's happening here. And we'll see what the effects have been of the study of mindfulness in just a bit. Even more recently, just 3 years ago or so, mindfulness research got its own journal called, appropriately enough, Mindfulness. But you notice how it's described. It's not a journal of meditative science. It's not a religious journal. It's a journal of cognitive psychology because above all, and most importantly, mindfulness is a mental state. And that's the way in which we're going to treat it. We're going to see this as a cognitive state, not a religious state, although some treat meditation that way. It is a cognitive state that we can produce, which is very important. And in fact, to give you another indication of just how penetrating this idea has been, this month's issue of Scientific American has this as its cover: the neuroscience of meditation. And of course, what they talk about almost exclusively in this article is mindfulness meditation. It was written by two neuroscientists and a Buddhist monk, which tells you something about its genesis. Now, one of the people who's been most influential in introducing, remarkably, in introducing mindfulness to the West and in trying to bring together the Western and Eastern traditions, the scientific and spiritual traditions, is the 14th Dalai Lama, seen here, who has written extensively on mindfulness and who was one of the founders of the Mind and Life Institute, which every 2 years he convenes a group of Western neuroscientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, and Buddhist meditators, in India usually, but not always, sometimes at MIT, to talk about the interpenetration of Western science and the meditative practices of Tibetan Buddhism. It's a remarkable marriage that has been very prolific, as we'll see. Now, we have to begin by talking about what mindfulness is. And here we run into a problem. The problem is stated very nicely by everyone who writes about mindfulness. What they start by saying is, you can't describe it. Imagine trying to describe the taste of chocolate to someone who has never tasted it. Just think about how difficult that would be. That, people say, is very much like trying to describe mindfulness to those who have not experienced it. Now, we can say something about what it is and what it's like, and that's what I'm going to try to do. Here, for example, is Stephen Hick, who is a therapist who uses mindfulness, and he says this: mindfulness is an embodied state that cannot accurately be described using language, as everyone says. It is defined by some as having a spiritual quality, by others within a strictly scientific orientation, and still others combine the two. Most see it as a way of living in the world, rather than as a set of techniques, a path that is cultivated through experience rather than absorbed from a book or, in fact, a talk, right? So let's move on and take a look at a couple of other very, I think, useful quotations about mindfulness. These come from a person whose work I'm going to mention, Jon Kabat-Zinn. I'll say more about him in a bit, but he writes very eloquently about mindfulness. He says, mindfulness is the process of observing body and mind intentionally, of letting your experiences unfold from moment to moment and accepting them as they are. It does not involve trying to control anything at all other than the focus and direction of your attention. It's about being here now. It does not involve, he says, trying to get anywhere or feel anything special. Rather, it involves allowing yourself to be where you already are, or to become more familiar with your actual experiences moment by moment. And those, I think, are excellent summaries. We'll delve into the components of this in a bit. My own summary, which I humbly offer, looks like this. Mindfulness is the mental habit of accepting and living fully, richly, and attentively in the present moment. And I'm not sure that's any better than anybody else's statement, but it's as close as I could get to one. Now, I want to kind of elaborate on these things, talk a bit about the history of mindfulness in the West. And it begins, in most people's estimation, with the work of this man, Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn. Now, Dr. Kabat-Zinn is not a medical doctor. He's not a psychologist. He is, in fact, he has a PhD in molecular biology, which he earned at MIT under the Nobel Prize winner Salvador Luria, who got his Nobel Prize for his work on viruses. But in 1979, he had spent many years studying in Eastern practices. He opened at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in Worcester, Massachusetts, what became the very first of many clinics. He called it the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Clinic, MBSRC. It began operating in 1979, and its purpose was to help medical patients at the University of Massachusetts hospitals deal with medical issues, pain, post-operative recovery, stress, all that sort of thing. And it was remarkably successful. In 1990, about 11 years after the clinic got started, he published his first book called, strangely enough, Full Catastrophe Living. you have to kind of read the postscript. Using the wisdom of your body to face stress, pain, and illness. It describes the work of the stress reduction clinic, describes the effects that 8-week program of mindfulness training had on the people who took that program. And it started a real flood of interest in mindfulness-based activities in a variety of both medical and psychiatric and other contexts. And we'll talk a bit about what some of those results proved to do. He's since retired now. He's still writing. His most recent book, I think, is just this year, Mindfulness for Parents. Anyway, and we'll come to that too in a bit. Anyway, so he's now retired as an emeritus professor of medicine, though of course he was never a medical doctor at all, as I said, molecular chemistry. Anyway, so I want to talk about the characteristics of mindfulness, the aspects, the various parts of the state of mind, and I'll be illustrating some of these with the words of Dr. Kabat-Zinn in a few places. So essentially we can identify, I think, 3 pieces or facets of mindfulness based on those descriptions that I read to you. One of them is intentional awareness of the now, both internal and external. Being aware of our environment in the present moment, both externally, the things that are happening around us, and the things that are going on inside our body and our mind. And we'll say more about that in a bit. Another very, 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 very important part of mindfulness, which makes it different, for example, from things like cognitive behavioral therapy, is that in mindfulness, you experience the present moment without judging or evaluating its quality. Feelings are not good, feelings are not bad, they are simply feelings. Thoughts are not good, thoughts are not bad, they're simply thoughts. And we simply notice their presence. And again, we'll elaborate on that a bit. And in general, as Kabat-Zinn will say, it's about accepting things as they are, which doesn't necessarily mean passivity or resignation. It means being aware of things as they are and knowing that's how they are and dealing with them as they come along. Now, people who write about mindfulness talk about a number of different qualities that occur in mindfulness training and practice. And here's where I want to illustrate some of these with the words of Kabat-Zinn, who does this better than anybody. We talked about non-judgment, very, very important. And here's what Kabat-Zinn says about this. Mindfulness is cultivated by assuming the stance of an impartial witness to your own experience. To do this requires that you become aware of the constant stream of judging and reacting to inner and outer experience that we are all normally caught up in, and learn to step back from it. When you find the mind judging, you don't have to stop it from doing that. All that is required is to be aware that it is happening. No need to judge the judging and then make matters even more complicated for yourself. So it's non-evaluative. There are no positives, there are no negatives. There are only things happening, and we are aware of them. Patience, something we all could use more of, I'm sure. And patience, as it applies to the state of mindfulness, Kabat-Zinn says this. When practicing mindfulness, we intentionally remind ourselves that there is no need to be impatient with ourselves because we find the mind judging all the time, or because we are tense or agitated or frightened. Why rush through some moments to get to other better ones? After all, each one is your life in that moment. To be patient is simply to be completely open to each moment, accepting it in its fullness, knowing that things can only unfold in their own time. Again, I think this is a uniquely non-Western habit. We don't tend to be as patient with others or ourselves as we might be, and it's certainly one of the qualities that are aspects of mindfulness. And one of my personal favorite, beginner's mind. The ideas inherent in mindfulness appeared in the West, as I said, just 400 or 500 years after they appeared in Buddhist tradition in the East. And in the 1940s and 1950s in particular, in North America, the work of the humanist personality psychologists like Carl Rogers, Abe Maslow, definitely touched on many aspects that we would now recognize as parts of mindfulness. And one of those is this beginner's mind. Maslow, in particular, said that a healthy adult individual, a self-actualized individual, as he called them, is childlike. Not childish, right? That's the worst side of childhood. Childlike. And one of those childlike qualities is a beginner's mind. And here's what Kabat-Zinn says of this. We tend to take the ordinary, he says, for granted and fail to grasp the extraordinariness of the ordinary. An open beginner's mind allows us to be receptive to new possibilities and prevents us from getting stuck in the rut of our own expertise, which often thinks it knows more than it does. No moment is the same as any other. Each is unique and contains unique possibilities. Beginner's mind reminds us of that simple truth. It is essentially the ability to experience, as he says, the ordinary over and over again. You see this in kids all the time. I remember a young boy a few years ago who would watch the same video every single day when he came home from school. I think it was The Lion King. Over and over and over and over, and he always laughed and cried in the same places every single time. He enjoyed it every day as though he was seeing it for the very first time. And yet we as adults, we tend to become jaded. Big sunset, seen that, been there, done that, right? Maybe even got the t-shirt, right? And the whole notion of being childlike about this is to continue to enjoy those everyday things of life, even though they are repeatedly experienced. Okay, trust. This is another issue that came up in the work of the humanists, who argued, as people in mindfulness field do, the best guide to what's right in the world is what you feel to be right for you. Right? As Obi-Wan Kenobi says in Star Wars, Luke, trust your feelings. Right? Believe in what you think is true. And here's what Kabat-Zinn says, although he doesn't mention Star Wars, I will say. It is far better to trust in your intuition and your own authority, even if you make some mistakes along the way, than always to look outside of yourself for guidance. If at any time something doesn't feel right to you, why not honor your feelings? Why should you discount them or write them off as invalid because some authority or some group of people think differently? It's impossible to become like somebody else. Your only hope is to become more fully yourself. In practicing mindfulness, you are practicing taking responsibility for being yourself and learning to listen to and trust your own being. The more you cultivate this trust in your own being, the easier you will find it to be to trust other people more and to see their basic goodness as well. All right, so trusting. Non-striving. This is a particularly important one, I think, at this time of the year, right? Yesterday on television news, all we saw was striving and grasping and clutching and buying and all that sort of thing, the Black Friday madness. And this is one of those areas where I think the West has much to learn from the East. And here's what Kabat-Zinn says about this. Almost everything we do, he says, is for a purpose, to get something or to be somewhere. But in meditation, this attitude can be a real obstacle. That's because although it takes a lot of work and energy of a certain kind, ultimately meditation is a non-doing. It has no goal other than for you to be yourself. The irony is that you already are. Yet this paradox may be pointing you toward a new way of seeing yourself, one in which you are trying less and being more. This comes from intentionally cultivating the attitude of non-striving. For example, he says, if you sit down to meditate and you think, I am going to get relaxed, or get enlightened, or control my pain, or become a better person, then you have introduced an idea into your mind of where you should be. And along with it comes the notion that you are not okay right now. If only I were more calm, or more intelligent, or a harder worker, or more this, or more that, then I would be okay. But right now I am not okay. This attitude undermines the cultivation of mindfulness, which involves simply paying attention to whatever is happening. If you are tense, pay attention to the tension. If you are in pain, then be with the pain as best you can. If you are criticizing yourself, then observe the activity of the judging mind. Just watch. Remember, we are simply allowing anything and everything that we experience from moment to moment to be here, because it already is. He also tells the story of how they work this in the mindfulness-based stress reduction clinic. As patients came in for the beginning of their 8-week sessions, he would ask them to write down 3 goals that they wanted to achieve. Things like lowering their blood pressure, reducing their stress, minimizing their pain, and so on and so forth. And after they'd done that, he would say, for the next 8 weeks, you are not to make any efforts to achieve these goals while you are in this program, right? Non-doing. And yet, of course, the outcome of the program, almost invariably, was the achievement of exactly those goals, without doing, without striving. Okay, acceptance. Well, we've come across this before. Briefly, what Kabat-Zinn says, sooner or later, we have to come to terms with things as they are and accept them. Often acceptance is only reached, and we'll be familiar with this process, after we have gone through many emotion-filled periods of denial and then anger. These stages are a natural progression in the process of coming to terms with what is. In the course of our daily lives, we often waste a good deal of time and energy denying and resisting what is already fact. This actually prevents positive change from occurring. We may be so busy denying and forcing and struggling that we have little energy left over for healing and growing. And what little we have may be dissipated by our lack of awareness and intentionality. And finally, letting go, non-attachment. This is a central feature of Buddhist philosophy, incidentally, the notion that, in fact, most of our suffering is because we want stuff. Right? I always point to the biblical verse, the love of money is the root of all evil. You notice this is often misquoted as money is the root of all evil. No, it's not money, it's the love of money. It's not having something that's the problem, it's wanting it that's the problem. And Buddhist philosophy agrees with this. Here's what Kabat-Zinn says about this. There are certain thoughts and feelings and situations that the mind seems to want to hold on to. Similarly, there are many thoughts and feelings and experiences that we try to get rid of, to prevent and protect ourselves from having them because they are unpleasant and painful and frightening in one way or another. In meditation practice, we intentionally put aside the tendency to elevate some aspects of our experience and to reject others. Instead, we just let our experiences be what it is and practice observing it from moment to moment. Letting go is a way of letting things be, of accepting things as they are. When we observe our own mind grasping and pushing away, we remind ourselves to let go of those impulses on purpose, just to see what will happen if we do. In Buddhist tradition, there's also the probably apocryphal story of the Indian monkey trap, so-called. It was the way that South Indians caught monkeys. What they would do is they would drill a small hole in a gourd or well, let's say a gourd, and they would, just large enough for a monkey's hand to go through, open hand. And inside they'd put some little goodies that the monkey might enjoy, and they'd chain this gourd to a stake in the ground so it couldn't be moved. The monkey would come along, sniff the goodies in the gourd, reach its hand in and grasp the stuff. But of course its full fist couldn't come out. All it had to do to escape was let go, but it wouldn't. Wouldn't let go, and it was caught. As so many of us, so the parable would say, are also caught by our failure to let go and our desire to keep on grasping things that we don't really need or want. Okay, so those are the qualities of mindfulness that we see as part of the mindful state. There are also other qualities that not necessarily part of the mindful state, but in the literature tend to emerge in individuals as mindfulness is practiced. And these are all, as you can imagine, fairly positive qualities. Gentleness, generosity, empathy, feeling, understanding, caring about others, gratitude, reverence for the moment, and loving kindness. There is a separate form of Buddhist meditation called loving kindness meditation, and it's one of the Dalai Lama's favorites. I want to say a word just to give an example of gratitude, because it's one of my favorite examples. Many years ago, when I was teaching an evening course with a lot of mature students, I was talking about one of the humanist philosophers and the importance of being alive in the moment and being grateful for all of that. And at the end of the class, an older man, probably as old as I am now, came up to me and said, I know exactly what he's talking about. He said, the very best thing that ever happened to me happened 3 years ago. And what was that? It's a nearly fatal heart attack. And of course, I was set back just a little. A nearly fatal heart attack was the best thing that ever happened to you? What's the rest of your life like? But he said that because he nearly died, he got up the next day and every day was a gift. Every moment was a gift he should never have had. And he said he'd lived that way ever since, treating every day with gratitude, every moment with gratitude. It was a very impressive experience for me. Okay, so those are some of the other qualities we see enhanced and developing as a result of mindfulness experience. Now I want to talk about what it's good for. Why should we want to do this? I mean, apart from wanting to be grateful right, and gentle and kind and compassionate. What does it do for us? Well, I mean, here the literature is so huge that it would take several days of continuous talking to describe what we have found about the benefits of mindfulness on a variety of aspects of human behavior, physiology. I'm just going to highlight, and very quickly, some of a few that I want to mention. First of all, it's been demonstrated that mindfulness practice, and no surprise here, develops improved attentional focus and awareness, and better visual discrimination, increased ability to tell one visual stimulus from another. Laboratory demonstrations. Here's one I always like to put up in my class. Mindfulness training improves learning and retention from university lectures. Let that be a lesson to all of us, but especially those who are university students. In healthcare workers, it's been shown to, and they took the course in the MBSR at Massachusetts, it's been demonstrated to reduce stress and improve general satisfaction with your life in those individuals. It increases empathy, understanding of others, awareness of others' point of view. It improves relationships. In a number of different ways. These are several studies that looked at couples of various degrees of closeness. And essentially, it's been shown to improve feelings of closeness between members of a couple, greater acceptance of the other member of the pair. And this is interesting, a greater sense of personal autonomy, a greater sense of personal choice and ability to make decisions in your own life, greater satisfaction with one's relationship. And as I said, these are the summary of 3 or 4 different studies at least. A generally increased sense of subjective well-being, satisfaction with life, right? Everything seems better to the individual who practices mindfulness. It's also, of course, been used very widely in the medical field, which is where it began in the MBSR clinic. It's been shown to be effective in dealing with chronic pain, reducing the symptoms of generalized anxiety, panic disorder, social anxiety, binge eating disorders. Where are we? And I'm going to mention this one, psoriasis. This is an interesting one. Psoriasis, as you know, is a nasty skin, an unpleasant skin condition. Its normal form of treatment is simply to shine a light on it for periods of time, and eventually it goes away. And in this study, what they did was they compared the usual treatment, light by itself, and they compared it with a treatment in which they, in addition to getting the light, they got mindfulness experience. And then they compared the length of time it took for these rashes to disappear. 65 days in the mindfulness plus light condition, 97 days in the light alone condition, right? So it shortened it by almost 30%, the amount of time in which the rash took to clear. Quite remarkable. And it's a mental state, right? It's not a physical manipulation. They didn't do anything to the skin, and yet that happened. Okay, well, now I said we'd get back to parenting in a minute. This is one of my favorite results. They gave mindfulness training not to the parents of children with autism and found improvements in the autism symptoms of the children. So train the parents, improve the kids. Now, we don't really know, and they didn't know, exactly what had changed in the parents' interaction with their autistic children, but something obviously had, in a way that improved the quality of the children's behavior. Because our behavior obviously is reflected back on us by the people with whom we interact. You get back what you give out. ADHD symptoms, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder symptoms improved after 8 weeks of stress reduction training at the MBSR. Reduced craving and substance use in addicts as a result of mindfulness training, again, at the MBSR clinic. Cancer patients. This is a growing area, incidentally. They reported lower stress, fewer mood disturbances after 6 months after mindfulness training. Their immune profile, one of the things that happens as a result of cancer treatment, of course, is your immune system gets whacked like hell. And these individuals showed a rebound of their immune system to normal functioning much more rapidly than a group that did not have this training. Blood pressure. This is an interesting one because it's about 12-year-olds. They've used mindfulness training in kids as low as as low as 10, and it works for them. This is a case where they were looking at kids, trying to get them to reduce even kids today have high blood pressure, for God's sake. It's terrible. And so they were working with a bunch of kids who had higher than average blood pressure. They were at risk. And they had two groups of kids. One was given mindfulness training, of course, and the other was given printed literature about how to behave so as to reduce your blood pressure and so on. And what they found was that the mindfulness group did, in fact, lower their blood pressure and their systolic heart rate, as I remember, whereas the group that received the printed documentation, their blood pressure went up. Quite the opposite direction. So mindfulness helped here, and educational literature did not. Depression. Now, this is an area where there's been very high and growing interest in the use of mindfulness. There's a group up in Toronto. Dr. Zindel Siegel has been heavily involved in this. And they were looking not at the treatment of depression, but at preventing relapse, because depression is typically an episodic condition. You have periods, bouts of depression, and then you return to relative normalcy, and then you may have another bout, and so on. So relapse is a fairly common experience. And so what they were testing is whether or not mindfulness training would reduce the probability of relapse. And that is, in fact, exactly what they found. That individuals were much more likely to relapse if they didn't have. They received treatment as usual, which is what TAU is, compared with mindfulness training. So 67% relapse for individuals receiving the usual treatment, 37% for those who received mindfulness-based training. But that only was true for those who'd had 3 or more depressive episodes. In other words, for those who were at the greatest risk for relapse. They were the most positively affected by this manipulation, which is always a good thing. Because normally, of course, the people most seriously affected are least affected by our treatments. Oh, and I wanted to mention this one because it just came in today. This is a paper that's not yet published in print. It's appeared on the website of this journal, the British Journal of Psychology. And it's about mindfulness group therapy used in treating patients with depression, anxiety, stress, and other conditions. And what they are reporting, this is the name of the authors here, Sundquist et al., as I said, coming out in a few months. What they found was they compared mindfulness group therapy with standard cognitive behavioral therapy, which has been shown to be very effective in treatment of depression, anxiety, stress, and so on. And they found that mindfulness group therapy was every bit as effective as standard cognitive behavioral therapy, which is quite a remarkable achievement. Since, as I say, CBT has been shown to be effective in a wide range of conditions, including the ones here. Quite interesting indeed. And again, these things are coming out almost literally every week. It's hard to keep up with the literature in mindfulness. As I said, this came in this morning on my desk. Now, I want to talk about, well, as I said, I think the adoption and the practice of mindfulness has really illustrated a profound shift in our understanding of the relationship between mind and body. We are much more aware in the West, and they always have been in the East, that there is really no separateness there. And that every system of the body, the cardiovascular system, the immune system, whatever, is very closely interlinked and related to our mental states. And research has shown, in fact, that all of those systems, cardiovascular, immune, whatever, are influenced by the mindfulness state and mindfulness training. Here's a study. This is one illustration. Study done in 2003. And they gave participants, the flu vaccine. What that does, of course, is increase the antibodies to the flu virus that occur in your system. And they gave it to two groups, one group that had been experiencing mindfulness training and another group that was waiting to get into mindfulness training. And what they found was that there were more flu antibodies in the bloodstream of the mindfulness group. Their immune system was more active, right? The flu vaccine was more effective in them than in the group that was waiting to take mindfulness training. Another finding, it's not related to the immune system, is they found higher levels of left hemisphere activation in the mindfulness group. Now, the importance about that is that left hemisphere activation is generally associated with higher levels of positive emotion, whereas right hemisphere activation is associated generally with higher levels of negative emotion or lower levels of positive emotion. And so they found essentially that they were differentially activating the left hemisphere in people with the positive emotion hemisphere in individuals with mindfulness training. Let's go back. And interestingly enough, that level of activation in the left hemisphere was correlated with the number of flu antibodies they found in the blood of these individuals. The higher your left hemisphere activation, the more flu antibodies you had. The happier you are, the better you are, essentially, is what it argues. Really quite remarkable. And they also found that in the mindfulness group, there was a lower level of inflammation, which is generally a bad thing, to stress. Again, a positive effect of mindfulness training. Now, I want to stop here for a moment before I go into the next result and remind ourselves of a revolution that's happening in our understanding in neuroscience. Years and years and years ago, when I was a student and had my first few years of instructors, as an instructor, I would teach my students that we never had more neurons in our brain than we did at birth. The maximum number of brain cells we had were at birth, and it was a steady, slow downhill slide from there. Neurons would die, you'd drink, and more would die, and so on, until finally you got into old age, and your remaining 9 neurons were barely working, and so on. So the argument was you never produced any new neurons. It was all downhill from birth. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, we discovered that there were at least a few brain areas, the hippocampus, a memory area in particular, that did produce brand new neurons, not only in adolescence, but in middle adulthood. And in the years since then, we've become aware that many areas of maybe all areas of the brain can produce new brain cells as well as new connections. This is the basis, of course, for all those mind training sorts of programs you see advertised on television, train your brain, blah, blah, blah. And while there is good science behind those efforts, there's no good evidence that those programs actually do anything. Although it's a good idea, I mean, in the sense that you use it or lose it is the standard routine, and that's probably pretty much true here. Okay. So, therefore, what does mindfulness training do? Does it do something to the brain? Yes, it does. It increases the thickness of the cortex. The cortex is a very thin layer of cells that contains about half the neurons in the brain, very thin layer that covers the entire outside of the brain. Right? And cortical thickness is a measure of how many neurons you've got there. And cortical thickness increases, sometimes quite dramatically, in individuals who have experienced mindfulness training. And it's thicker in particular areas where, in the prefrontal lobes, which are the most human areas we have, attention areas, learning areas, memory areas, virtually every important function experiences a growth in number of neurons based on or after mindfulness training. This is quite a remarkable result, really. So if you want to do something to increase your brain, this would be one of the things you might want to try. Another very interesting finding from this particular study is the biggest differences, the biggest improvements in cortical thickness were in the oldest participants, the ones at most risk for dementia and declining cognitive ability. So where it was needed most, it seemed to do the most good. A quite remarkable finding, indeed. Okay, now, another slight digression about genetics. For many years, until fairly recently, the dogma, if I could call it that in genetics, was that the only thing that matters, the only thing that contributes to differences between people is the genes you have. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? You have different genes, you have different body shapes, types, sizes, whatever else. The only thing that differentiates one person from another in terms of genetic foundation is the particular genes that they have. Well, we've discovered, or become to realize really, that's not true. That in a broad sense, the genes you have don't matter. What matters is the genes you have that are turned on or turned off, right? And that's a very different thing. I'll get there. And the other thing we thought about these genes is that genes are only changed by insult, radiation, mutations occur and so on and so forth. And of course, they might actually be, the other thing we believed was that our own personal life experiences do not change our genome. They change nothing about our genes. That may be true. But then we discovered epigenetics. Well, we didn't discover it. We knew about it years and years ago. Epigenetics is the the little note, the little post-it notes, chemical post-it notes that are attached to the genome that say, don't turn this gene on, turn this gene off, and so on and so forth. So the epigenome determines which genes are actually active in which cells of the body. We knew about that because, of course, brain cells are different from muscle cells, which are different from kidney cells, and so on. Why are they different? Despite the fact they all contain the same genes, they're different because of the epigenome. The markers in brain cells are different. They say, turn these genes off. In liver cells, those genes are on, and some other genes are turned off because of the markers, the epigenetic markers, right? And then we realize that that's a very, very important process in a lot of things, right? So it's not just about differentiating cell types, it's about a whole lot of other things as well. And there were two things we discovered about the epigenome that are really, really, really fascinating and revolutionary. The first is that our life experiences affect our epigenome. The genes that are turned on and off in our body depend on what we have experienced as individuals. Things that happened to us in the womb, things that happened around the time we were born, bullying in primary school, poor or good nutrition, diseases we encounter. All of these things can change our epigenome. There was a fascinating program on last night on the CBC about, I think it was The Nature of Things, about identical twins and how different they can be, despite having exactly the same genome. They share all their genes in common. One poor pair, one woman had, she was perfectly healthy. Her twin sister had come down with 2 different forms of cancer, of one of which she finally died. Why didn't they both have cancer? Why did only one? The answer is the epigenome was different. Now, we don't know how exactly, but that's the thing. Identical twins are not even identical because of difference in their epigenetic markers. So our life experiences affect how our genes work. More than that, the second bit of revolutionary discovery is we can pass those epigenetic changes that happen to us on to our children. The things that happen to us at birth or around birth or in the womb affect our kids. And in fact, the data suggests they can go as far as the second generation, affecting our grandchildren. This is scary and fascinating, isn't it? So what happened to your parents when they were young has affected your epigenome and therefore the genes that are active in your body, just as what's happened to you may affect your grandkids. That is an astonishing thing. But why do I bring that up in the context of mindfulness? Well, I think you can guess. The evidence is that mindfulness meditation changes gene expression epigenetically. Right? So by meditating, practicing mindfulness, you are changing the things that happen in your body with respect to genetic expression. This is astonishing. Absolutely. This is something you and I can do to change how our genes work. I mean, that's mind-boggling. That is absolutely mind-boggling. And this is a particular study that mentioned this. We don't really care about what these particular genes are, but essentially, the genes that were reduced in expression after mindfulness are those that modify the epigenome. Right? And inflammatory, as I said, inflammation is a bad thing. And any gene that promotes inflammation, we really don't want to have too active. And these pro-inflammatory genes were turned down in individuals who practiced mindfulness. Astonishing. Absolutely astonishing. And we're going to see an awful lot more research like this. But there's no doubt this is an extraordinarily fruitful field. People are now beginning to look at the effects, or already looking at the effects of the epigenome on cardiovascular health, on diabetes, on obesity, and they're finding things. They're also looking at things like schizophrenia, depression, and again, the evidence suggests we will find epigenetic effects, and perhaps this will be one of the ways we can modify those. Really interesting stuff. Well, okay, so we've talked about all the good stuff that mindfulness training and practice can do. What the hell is mindfulness training and practice about? Well, I can't go into it in detail, but let me just give you kind of a brief flavor of this. In both the Western and the Eastern traditions, we look at mindfulness at 3 levels of generality, if you like. At the first level, for beginners, we always focus on body mindfulness, being aware of what's happening inside your body. And that almost always begins with breathing, right? If you've taken a beginning class in mindfulness, the first thing they'll ask you to do is sit quietly, relax, and focus on your breathing. Many forms of meditation begin exactly this way. Breathing is a good thing to focus on because it never stops, hopefully, and it's easy to pay attention to. We notice it, right? We can pay attention to it. And then once you're able to do that for 2, 3, 4 minutes at a time, always bringing your attention back when your mind begins to wander, of course, as it will. But we don't worry about that. We don't judge that, right? We just bring our focus back to the breathing and so on. And then when we can do that reliably, we engage in what Kabat-Zinn calls, and other people do as well, the whole body scan, which essentially is making yourself aware of your entire body piece by piece. Kabat-Zinn describes the process they follow in the MBSR, where you begin by noticing you're lying down usually, noticing the toes on your right foot, focusing on them, paying attention to their level of tension, moving your focus of attention up to your left ankle and so on, all the way upper leg, down the other, and then repeat the process. It may take several minutes, of course, all the way up through your entire body. He says that when you're good at this, the body disappears. It becomes transparent. You no longer feel it at all. It's like it's not there. I've never had exactly that feeling, but I've come close. Very interesting. So, body scan. Once we're able to do that, then we move on to the mental side of things. A focus on our thoughts and our emotions. And again, what we're doing here is we are simply noticing the things that are happening in the cognitive frame. We're not trying to stop anything from happening. We're not trying to stop any thoughts, block any emotions, produce any particular forms of thinking. No. We just notice what is happening. There are a number of different metaphors or similes that people use to describe this process. One I've heard of is you imagine your thoughts or emotions are little packages moving by on a conveyor belt. You just notice as they move by and then let them move on. Right? And there are dozens and dozens of these interesting metaphors, but that's basically the idea. You don't evaluate. You don't worry about them. You don't judge, oh my God, I shouldn't have this thought. I should be thinking this. No. You just become aware of what you're thinking and notice it and then let it recede in its own time, patiently. And finally, there is the broadest form of mindfulness, the one we all hopefully seek and hopefully achieve, and that is mindfulness in everyday life. And this is essentially being fully aware and invested in and living in the moment right now as completely as possible. There's a classic Buddhist story about a villager who visits a monastery up on the hill beside his village. And he asks the monks, what is it that you guys do up here? Because, of course, he's never visited before. And the monk says, well, we walk, we eat, we garden. And the visitor says, yeah, but that's what everybody does. That's what all of us in the village do. And the monk smiles and says, yes, but when we walk, we know we're walking. When we eat, we know we're eating. And when we garden, we know we're gardening. And what he's talking about is mindfulness. Being fully aware in that moment of what you're doing. Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Buddhist monk, I think he passed away just recently, who lived in France for many years. Yes, too bad. Wrote a number of marvelous books. I highly recommend them. I might even, well, maybe I have a slide later. And he's very earthy about this. He says, when you go to the bathroom, that should be your focus. When you're washing the dishes, that should be your focus, and so on. He takes very earthy examples, but it's the same idea. He says every act is a rite. It's a ritual. If you are fully there, right, you are going to be fully absorbed in the moment and fully aware of the things that are going on. All right, so that's mindfulness in daily life. A difficult achievement, no question. I mean, even the Dalai Lama complains about how difficult it is for him to do this. He doesn't have time for the practice that he used to have, right? Okay, now, so I want to kind of wind up with three, I hate to say take-homes, I hate that phrase, but anyway, three basic large ideas that I hope will stick with you as you leave. And the first of these is the fact that mindfulness illustrates the incredibly powerful interaction and interrelationship between the mind and the body. And of course, again, as I said, we've always focused on the effects of changing body state on how that changes the mind. What we spent much less time thinking about, and now people are becoming more aware of, is just how powerfully the things we think affect the functioning of the body. We see it all over the place, and mindfulness isn't the only thing that does this, of course. right? Any form of belief can do this. You talk about those people who believe in voodoo curses. They're told that they've been cursed and they will die, and they go home, and the next day they are dead, right? That's the power of thinking. That's the power of belief. And mindfulness shares that power, though, in a good way. It is not the dark side, but the light side of the force, if you like. Okay? So it beautifully illustrates the power of this connection and what we can do with our thoughts to affect the functioning of our body. The other thing that's really fascinating about this is it's something we have control over, right? It's something we can do. It's not something out there that people have to do for us. It's not, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's something we can achieve. If 12-year-olds can do it, right, anybody potentially can do it with more or less difficulty, but it can be done. It is a way we can have control, not only of the contents of our mind in some respects, but through those with the contents and activity of our body. That is quite a wonderful thing. It may mean, and based on some of the studies we've seen, less reliance on physical methods of treatment, drugs. Drugs all have side effects, right? You may have to take them for years and years and years. You can't overdose on mindfulness. There are no toxic levels of mindfulness. You don't have to spend the rest of your life in paying money to be mindful. You can do this on your own. This is an incredibly powerful possibility, I think, whose possibilities we're just beginning to realize. These are early days yet in this incredibly fast-growing field. And finally, and this is related to the first point, I think, think about what the study of mindfulness and the neuroscience of mindfulness, the beauty part about this is we can watch the brains of people doing this. We can see what's happening in the minds and brains of people who are practicing mindfulness. These studies have been going on for a long time now and are continuing apace. We can watch what's happening. We can then perhaps answer some really, really important, deep, and fascinating questions about the relationship between mind and body, the relationship between various parts of the brain, and ultimately perhaps about the nature, the greatest mystery of all, perhaps, the nature of consciousness. Why do we know anything at all? Why are we aware of anything at all? Right? So it's a fascinating and important area. As I said, it's growing dramatically. Thousands of papers already out, dozens coming out almost literally every week or every month. And it's something I think you'll be reading and hearing a lot more about in the future. Thank you very much.